Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we will be reviewing the final preseason game of this year's training camp between the San Jose Sharks and the Vegas Golden Knights. So finally, the preseason is coming to an end. The start of the regular season is just, well, at least for the Sharks, the start of the regular season for the Sharks is just 1 week away, where they will play their first game of the season against the Winnipeg Jets. For the Golden Knights and for the NHL as a whole, the season actually starts in just 3 days on Tuesday. And so for this game, as expected, the Sharks were running a lineup that is going to be very, very similar to the one they will likely end up starting this season with. There were only a couple of changes here or there from their previous preseason game against the Anaheim Ducks, and I suspect we won't see more than a change or two going into the season start, besides for the, injured players stepping back into the lineup, like, for instance, Barabanov, who likely, at least according to Bob Booner, will indeed be in the lineup for Game 1. And before we actually get into analyzing some of the players here, which, by the way, I should note, I won't be specifically mentioning every single player that played in the lineup. That was something I did in my previous preseason view over a week ago, mostly because it was a lot of new blood, I guess you could say, a lot of inexperienced players that were very interesting to watch. Here tonight, there's a lot of veteran type of players, and so is it really important to mention how Brent Burns did in a preseason game? Not really. So I'll be mentioning the big and interesting names for the San Jose Sharks, but not necessarily everyone. But before I get into that, I do want to talk about the newest San Jose Shark, Jonah Gadjovich. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. Was actually waived by the Vancouver Canucks a couple of days ago, and the San Jose Sharks decided to pick him up off of the waiver wire. Now, the waiver wire is quite interesting because during the season you could see it being slightly more active in terms of teams actually wanting to pick up specific players, because sometimes certain teams, nothing is necessarily working for them, and so they want to just get a fresh face onto the team to try and really boost them up. But when it comes to in training camp, you're trying to really make it work with the players that you have, and you're trying to figure out who should be on your roster, who's really playing themselves into a spot, and who's really playing themselves back into a spot on your minor league team. And so you're kind of sending down a ton of players and waiving a ton of your own players. The Sharks just earlier today waived Dylan Gambrell. And so the fact that they actually picked up a player like Gadjovich shows that the Sharks definitely really want him on the team for this season. Remember, the Sharks actually made a waiver wire pickup at the start of last season. And of course, that was none other than Rudolph Balcers at the time, who, of course, as we know, ended up playing a good chunk of last season and is looking like a very solid player for the San Jose Sharks this year. Not to say Gadjovich is going to end up going the same way, but clearly this guy, while he may or may not actually be in the lineup come Game 1 of the season, he should end up playing at least a decent chunk of games going into this next year. But talking about the players who actually did end up playing in this game, we start off with the first line of Dahlen, Couture, and Meyer. This was probably the Sharks' best line here tonight. I thought Couture and Meyer were both very, very good here, and I do obviously want to talk about Dahlen a good amount. At the start of this preseason, I was hesitantly putting him on the, third line. He was obviously a player who's much more offensively oriented, and so he's not necessarily built to be a player playing 8 minutes on the fourth line. You want him at the very least in your top 9, and I had positioned him on the third line because I wasn't really sure what to expect from him. Yes, he had been very good overseas last season, but that was in the second tier Swedish league. What could we expect from him at the NHL level? And of course, this is just preseason, but this was a very impressive game from Dahlen. He actually scored the first goal of this game for the San Jose Sharks as he finished off a pretty passing play between all of the Sharks players, including Erik Karlsson, Logan Couture, and Timo Meier. And he actually had a couple of other glorious chances in the first period. He could have probably had a hat trick in just the first 20 minutes alone if he were able to finish the opportunities he actually ended up getting. There was one on the power play. It was a great seam pass from, I believe, Timo Meier, and he goes for the one-timer, but he just barely fans on it. It would have been a pretty easy goal to score from that position. There was also one where he found himself alone in front of the net, couldn't bury it past Robin Lehner, but just generally he found himself in the right place at the right time. He had some very solid chemistry with both Couture and Timo Meier, and I'm excited to see what he can do going into the regular season, because it seems at this point that he's pretty much destined to be on this first line for Game 1 against the Winnipeg Jets. Moving on to the second line here, a slight change from what we saw in the previous game, or at least what some people saw, because obviously I didn't get to watch it, but from what we saw in that previous game against the Anaheim Ducks, that line had been Hertl, Eklund, and Barabanov. Barabanov not getting this game, still sort of dealing with an injury, I guess you could say, and it ends up being Rudolf Balcers, which I thought worked out very, very well, because I thought Balcers was the best player on this line, even though a lot of people will be talking about Eklund, and let's be that one person. As let's talk about Eklund here. Obviously, a pretty successful game for William Eklund. He scored in this one, and it was just over a week ago when I was talking about that preseason game that I actually did get to watch against the Anaheim Ducks, and I had mentioned that I felt as though Eklund would probably could use some more seasoning time at the AHL level. I thought he would need to get a bit more used to the smaller ice, as well as get a bit stronger to really come back for a very, very good 22-23 season. And at that time, I didn't think that take was pretty crazy. You know, a lot of people surrounding the Sharks were hoping that Eklund could make the team, but wouldn't have been surprised if he did not end up making that team. But then a few days later, the Sharks played that second to last preseason game against the Anaheim Ducks that I obviously didn't get to watch, as I've mentioned, and Eklund was apparently very, very impressive there. And here tonight, Eklund was still rather impressive. I thought he actually had a lot of chemistry with Rudolf Balcers, and just as I had pointed out back when I watched him all the way back in that rookie tournament, almost a month ago, at this point, I talked about how Eklund did a lot of the little things correctly, and we saw that absolutely here tonight. But when you're playing in the top six, you have to not only be doing those little things correctly, like we could compare him to a player like Logan Couture, who seems to have that part of the game down pat, but you also have to be doing the big things offensively. And Eklund hadn't necessarily been showing that through the games he had played, but here tonight, there were definitely some nice plays. He obviously scored that goal, and so I suspect that the Sharks are going to be slotting him in come that first game of the regular season. And I must say that even though I didn't expect this to be the case, and I'm still unsure whether or not it is 100% the correct choice, hopefully we don't end up regretting it and having, looking back on this moment 3 years from now and saying, well, why did the Sharks rush Eklund to the NHL? I will say I am very excited to see him play a first regular season game. Moving on to the third line, it ended up being Labanc, Bonino, and Matt Nieto. So Labanc draws back into the lineup here tonight after he missed the previous game against the Anaheim Ducks as a mini punishment, I guess you could say, for that previous game before that. Also against the Anaheim Ducks, where he did not look particularly good. Labanc did score a goal here tonight on the power play, but otherwise I wouldn't say looked amazing. Had some decent plays. The player who I was really impressed with on this third line was actually Nick Bonino, and the signing of Nick Bonino that the Sharks did this past offseason really reminds me of a signing they did back in the 2015 offseason when they brought on Joel Ward. Joel Ward was also a player like Bonino who is sort of a two-way guy, definitely plays a very responsible defensive game, can be sort of a net front presence on a power play, can get some penalty killing time as well, and is just a very solid third line player. And Bonino, even has the slight edge onto Joel Ward in being a centerman compared to Joel Ward, who of course was more of a winger, I guess you could say, for most of his time with the San Jose Sharks. And so I've definitely really enjoyed Bonino, especially early on in this game. I thought he really made a mark on this game, and I'm definitely very excited to see how he's going to work in this third line center role for the San Jose Sharks. They have him on a pretty cheap contract, and it's not particularly long term, so hopefully this can end up going down as one of the better signings in recent Sharks history. And then moving on to the fourth line, we got a bit of a new look to it. Instead of the Vial, Weatherby, and Raska line that we've seen for the past couple of games, we end up still getting Weatherby as the fourth line center, but he is joined by Cogliano as well as Lane Pedersen. This was not a great line here tonight. Weatherby, while he had started this training camp off exceptionally well, these past couple of games that I've watched him play haven't been all that great. Cogliano had some decent defensive plays, but as expected, he's not necessarily necessarily bringing a ton to the table offensively. And while Lane Peterson had a couple of looks, I would say generally this fourth line was maybe more leaning towards liability than being a solid fourth line for the San Jose Sharks. Of course, this is a preseason game, so it doesn't necessarily mean a ton, but if there are going to be changes to this lineup going into this first game of the regular season against the Jets in a week's time, this is probably where I would expect those changes, and maybe look for a player like Gadjevich, who the Sharks picked up off of waivers from the Vancouver Canucks, to fill in one of these spots on that fourth line. Moving on to the defensive side of things, we of course have Ferraro and Burns. Not really much to say about those two players. On the second pairing, however, we ended up getting Erik Karlsson with Santeri Hatakka. That was definitely a very interesting pairing, one that I definitely had wanted to see in the previous game, but for whatever reason the Sharks decided to go with Karlsson and Middleton and then Hatakka with Vlasic. But now we're getting that sort of defensive offensive duo here as this second pairing, and you could definitely argue that they were the best defensive pairing for the San Jose Sharks here tonight. Erik Karlsson obviously had that very nice pass on that first Dahlin goal. Otherwise, there were obviously some slight issues, as usual, with the defensive side of Karlsson's game, but that's not really important here in the preseason. Really, I want to talk about Santeri Hatakka. He looked pretty solid. Obviously, there were a couple of speed bumps, as you would expect from a rookie player. Kind of reminds me of when we saw Nikolai Knyzhov getting his first couple of games this past season, and he ended up settling into things. It'll be very interesting to see how the Sharks' defensive pairings actually end up shaping up come the start of this season, because the big question mark is, of course, what is going on with Knyzhov. He has not played a single preseason game, if I'm not mistaken, during this training camp. He's been dealing with an injury. And so I'm not entirely sure if he's going to be ready for that first game of the season, or if he's not ready for that first game of the season, how long he's actually going to be out. Because the thing is, if, let's say, just as an example, Knyzhov is indeed ready to play come first game of the regular season, the Sharks will be sitting in a situation where they have 7 defensemen that they could potentially play, but only 6 roster spots. And obviously Ferraro, Burns, Karlsson, they're all going to be staying in the lineup. Knyzhov, I suspect, will make round out that top 4, and so you're deciding between 3 players of Vlasic, Shemek, and Hatakka. And at this point, it seems as though with the amount of games that Hatakka has been getting over these past few preseason games, that he should have his slot come the start of the regular season. So that begs the question, will Knyzhov actually be ready? Is he actually expected to be out for the first few games of the regular season? Will Vlasic sit out? Will Shemek sit out? Because while we did see a third pairing here of Shemek and Middleton to me just screams backup defenseman. But the question, of course, is if indeed Knyzhov does come back and rounds up that top 4, and then Shemek and Vlasic make up the top 6, I don't think Hatakka should end up being that 7th defenseman. I would much rather Middleton stay along as that 7th defenseman and have Hatakka play big minutes in the minor league. Potentially it's a pairing with Ryan Merkley, and that could be a strong defenseman pairing for the San Jose Barracuda this season. If indeed Knyzhov is out somewhat long term, then sure, get Hatakka into the lineup, or if you do plan on benching a player like Shemek or a player like Vlasic, of course, Hatakka would work perfectly fine. But if he ends up being the 7th defenseman, I'd much rather him move down to the AHL level and just keep Middleton there in that role. And then finally, moving on to the goaltending, Adin Hill finally returning here in this game. Of course, had dealt with a bit of an injury, so didn't get to play in these past couple of games. James Reimer did so instead, and Adin Hill looked quite solid in this game. Obviously ended up getting a shutout in this one, the 4-0 win for the San Jose Sharks. And for those wondering who were the goal scorers in this game, I've already mentioned a couple. Dahlin and then Kevin Labanc obviously scored on the power play. Then I also mentioned that William Eklund made it 3-0, and I believe Brent Burns, off of some crazy deflections, ended up making it 4-0 near the end of this game. But Adin Hill, very, very solid. There were a couple of moments that were slightly shaky. Some rebound control came into question a bit, but luckily the Sharks actually did a pretty decent job in front of the net, clearing out those potential rebounds. But otherwise, Hill, some very solid goaltending, which I guess is kind of a breath of fresh air for Sharks fans after the goaltending issues that the Sharks and their fans have had to deal with over these past couple of seasons. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks, as I've mentioned time and time again, will be back in action. I am very excited for this game coming up in a week's time against the Winnipeg Jets. And this preseason honestly has gone pretty well for the Sharks. A lot of these younger players who maybe the Sharks weren't necessarily expecting to step up as soon as they have done so. Dallin has looked much more solid than expected. Eklund is seemingly more ready than most people thought he would be. Hataka has kind of come out of nowhere, just an under-the-radar player. And even players who may not actually be making the team this season, at least right out the gate, like Adam Raska, have also looked very impressive. So even if the Sharks don't necessarily end up having the best of regular seasons this year, the future is beginning to look much brighter for the San Jose Sharks. Class dismissed.